What if this mighty Roman legions were not only warriors of steel, but warriors of the shadows? What if Rome's true power did not lie in the sword, but in its spies? For centuries, we've been told that the Roman Empire conquered the world through iron discipline, ruthless efficiency, and overwhelming strength on the battlefield. But that's only half the story. Behind the gleaming armor and the thunder of marching legions, Rome possessed another weapon, one hidden in the shadows. Imagine the CIA, the FBI, or the Secret Service, but draped in togas and sandals, operating more than 2,000 years ago. These men were not just soldiers. They were scouts, infiltrators, informants, and assassins. They gathered intelligence, sabotaged enemies, and even kept watch over Rome's own citizens. They were the proto-intelligence agencies of antiquity, the secret backbone that allowed the Roman Empire to control 3 continents. Today, we pull back the curtain on this untold story, exploring the shadowy forces of the Procuratores, the Exploratores, the Speculatores, and most feared of all, the Frumentarii. This is the hidden history of Rome's intelligence services, the ancient world's answer to espionage. When we picture early Rome, it is tempting to see a rustic community of straightforward citizens, men who marched into battle with little more than iron courage and blind faith. Ancient historians like Livy and Frontinus reinforced this idealized image. Rome, they claimed, did not triumph through cunning or deceit, but through sheer bravery, through heroes willing to sacrifice themselves in defense of their city. And yet, when we look closely at the record, the picture begins to crack. The chronicles leave us with details that are at once tragic and almost unbelievably naive. One account describes how news of a Roman army's destruction did not come by a swift rider galloping through the gates, nor by smoke rising from signal fires, but by a far more haunting sight: broken shields floating silently down the Tiber River. The people of Rome gathered along its banks, staring into the current, realizing with horror that their sons, husbands, and fathers were gone forever. Frontinus himself went so far as to claim that in the days of the monarchy and early republic, the Romans were strangers to the art of espionage. To them, trickery, guile, and deception were shameful acts beneath the dignity of a true Roman citizen. Better, he wrote, to be surprised than to win by dishonor. On the surface, it sounds noble. It fits the Roman self-image: stern, virtuous, unyielding. But can this really be the whole truth? Could a small city on the banks of the Tiber, hemmed in by powerful neighbors and hostile tribes, truly have survived centuries of bloody conflict on courage alone? Could Rome really have risen from an obscure settlement to dominate the Mediterranean if it was completely blind to the schemes and conspiracies of its enemies? The reality, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Rome was undoubtedly brave. Its soldiers fought with tenacity that awed friend and foe alike. But bravery alone cannot explain survival on such a scale. Beneath the legends of noble sacrifice, there must also have been cunning: spies listening in taverns, scouts riding ahead to probe the terrain, whispers exchanged in shadowed alleys. Rome wanted the world to believe it stood above such methods, but the truth is more complex. Rome's survival and its eventual supremacy was not just forged in open battle, it was also shaped by secrets. When Roman armies still lingered in the safe heartlands of Latium or Etruria, scouting was simple. A few horsemen sent ahead could scan the road, check the terrain, and be back by nightfall. But as the Republic expanded, the game changed. Once the legions marched beyond their familiar countryside into the jagged mountains of Samnium, or across the sea to the contested lands of Sicily, the need for organized professional reconnaissance became more urgent than ever. No longer were they marching across gentle fields or paved roads that always led back to Rome. Instead, they entered hostile landscapes in a forest where an ambush could spring from any thicket, narrow passes where an entire column could be crushed, valleys where hidden streams might provide life or death. In this environment, a single wrong turn, a missed ridge, a failure to notice a concealed gorge could mean the destruction of an entire army. It was in this crucible that the Romans forged a new type of force. The Procuratores mounted detachments who spread out like a living shield around the marching columns. By day, they rode ahead to sweep the ground clear, probing for danger, intercepting deserters or enemy scouts. By night, they patrolled the darkness, their ears tuned to every rustle in the brush, their eyes straining for the flicker of a torch. They became Rome's early warning system, the fragile line that stood between the legions and annihilation. But the Procuratores were far more than mere guards. They were pathfinders. Their task was to guide the army's advance, weighing each choice of direction. Which fork in the road led to drinkable water? Which valley offered forage for men and beasts? Which route was swift and which was suicide? A good procurator could deliver his generals safely to the battlefield. A bad one might doom 50,000 men to thirst, hunger, or ambush. The weight of such decisions was crushing and yet essential. Ancient anecdotes even warn us of what happened when their advice was ignored. One tale often told is that of Emperor Valentinian, who, dismissing the warnings of his Procuratores, chose what seemed an easier path. The result was catastrophe. His army blundered into an ambush. Historians debate the details, but the moral endures. To disregard your scouts was not simply reckless, it was to wager the lives of your men on a coin toss. This image forces us to see the Procuratores for what they were. Not common patrolmen, but the beating heart of Rome's intelligence on campaign. They were the recon patrols of the ancient world, the soldiers who illuminated the road ahead. Without them, Rome's mighty legions, disciplined, armed, invincible in formation, would have been reduced to nothing more than a blind giant, stumbling forward into the dark, waiting for the inevitable fall. If the Procuratori were the close ring of scouts, shielding each step of the marching legions, then the Exploratores were Rome's long-range eyes, cavalry detachments that rode beyond the horizon, crossing valleys, scaling ridges, and disappearing from sight for days, sometimes weeks, at a time. Picture a Roman camp at dawn. The morning mist clings to the ground, and as the first rays of sunlight break over the horizon, groups of horsemen gather at the gates. At a signal, they ride out in silence. Soon they split into smaller detachments, scattering in every direction like ripples on a pond. Some head toward the mountains, others trace the lines of rivers, others vanish into forests. At night, they make rough camps by streams or in the shadow of hills. Their fires flicker like faint stars across the landscape, signals to one another that the mission continues. At dawn, they ride again. Along the dusty roads, their eyes scan the horizon. A low, wide cloud of dust tells them infantry is on the march. A tall, narrow plume means cavalry is on the move. Every sign, every trace of the enemy was a piece of the puzzle. But the Exploratores were more than watchers. They were analysts and interpreters of the world around them. They memorized landscapes, mapped valleys and ridges, and assessed which terrain offered safety and which concealed peril. They gauged the morale of enemy troops from a distance, noting whether soldiers marched in neat ranks or dragged their feet in exhaustion. They surveyed sources of water, fields for foraging, and mountain passes that could serve as choke points or escape routes. And beyond observation, they also tapped into Rome's networks of spies, listening to whispers in markets and taverns, piecing rumor into intelligence. In this way, they were an unusual blend of spies, scouts, and psychological warfare specialists, the ancient equivalent of today's special operations reconnaissance teams. And when the moment demanded it, they were not afraid to act. One name carved into gravestones and immortalized on the column of Trajan still echoes today: Tiberius Claudius Maximus. Tasked with hunting down Rome's greatest enemy in Dacia, King Decebalus, Maximus pursued him across hills and forests. Cornered after a desperate chase, Decebalus chose suicide over capture, drawing his sword across his throat. But Maximus did not stop. He severed the king's head and carried it back as a grisly trophy for Emperor Trajan, brutal, ruthless, and yet celebrated as a triumph. It was the kind of efficiency Rome demanded from its elite scouts. To see, to act, to deliver results, no matter how grim. And yet even Rome's all-seeing eyes were not infallible. During the campaign in Arabia, the legions placed their trust in a local guide to lead them through the desert. The man betrayed their confidence, whether by accident or design, no one can say, and led them along a meandering path. The march took 3 times longer than expected. Soldiers collapsed from thirst, animals starved, supplies dwindled. The proud legions, battered not by battle but by attrition, were forced to retreat in humiliation. It was a lesson carved into Roman memory. When intelligence fails, disaster follows. The Exploratores, Rome's far-reaching eyes, were both a source of pride and of dread. Their successes paved the way for Rome's greatest victories, allowing generals to strike first and strike hard. But their failures could unravel entire campaigns. For an empire that prided itself on discipline and control, it was a reminder of a sobering truth. Sometimes the fate of Rome depended not on the clash of legions, but on what a handful of riders saw or failed to see beyond the next hill. If the Procuratores were the close-range scouts, and the Exploratores Rome's long-range eyes, then the Speculatores were the ghosts within the enemy's ranks, the third layer of Roman intelligence, infiltrating deep behind hostile lines. Imagine a silent night in Gaul. Inside his camp, Caesar was restless, uneasy about rumors that the enemy had abandoned their position. He refused to act hastily. Then through the darkness, a speculator returned, breathless, reporting, "The enemy has broken camp in chaos without orders. Without command, it looks like a rout." Immediately, Caesar halted his legions, suspecting an ambush. By sunrise, the news was confirmed. Thanks to the Speculatores, Caesar had avoided a deadly trap and turned the tide. These men were not mighty cavalrymen, but chameleons. They shed their Roman armor and slipped into whatever guise the mission required. A wandering deserter, a harmless merchant, a courteous diplomat, even an enemy soldier. Under these disguises, they listened to gossip in markets, traded whispers in taverns, and sometimes sat in enemy camps themselves, memorizing every detail from the number of horses to the weary expressions on soldiers' faces. But they were not only gatherers of intelligence. The Romans almost certainly used them to spread falsehoods and rumors, to undermine morale and sow discord within enemy ranks. Though ancient sources do not record the details, it is nearly certain that psychological warfare was part of their arsenal. History even preserves one striking example: the Battle of Actium. It was deserters, sometimes little more than disguised agents, who revealed to Octavian the secret plan of Antony and Cleopatra to break through the naval blockade and escape to Egypt. With this intelligence, Octavian prepared his counterstroke, and in doing so, reshaped the destiny of Rome. In many ways, the Speculatores were the CIA field operatives of the ancient world undercover agents. Double dealers who could switch sides overnight, carrying with them information powerful enough to save an entire army or doom an empire. For them, victory was not won by spear or sword, but by the whispered secrets of the night. But espionage in Rome wasn't just about scouts. It was about control. If the Procuratores, Exploratores, and Speculatores were the eyes of the Roman legions, then the Frumentarii were the emperor's hidden hand, feeding Rome on the one hand, while strangling dissent on the other. At first, their duties seemed almost mundane. They were humble soldiers tasked with ensuring the empire's lifeblood, food. The word frumentum itself meant grain, and it was this grain that sustained Rome's ever-hungry population and armies. The Frumentarii fanned out across the provinces, supervising harvests, monitoring shipments, and ensuring that sacks of wheat and barley flowed steadily down the roads and rivers into the belly of the capital. But in Rome, even something as simple as bread carried immense power. Whoever controlled grain controlled the people. And soon, from these humble duties, a new form of authority sprouted: the power to control information. Because when you know who grows the grain, who sells it, who stores it, and who eats it, you don't just control food. You keep your finger on the pulse of society. And it was from this insight that the Frumentarii evolved. They were no longer merely grain men. They became the emperor's imperial secret police, his shadow enforcers, operating in silence and fear. According to the Historia Augusta, a source more anecdotal than factual, but rich in intrigue, Emperor Hadrian even used the Frumentarii to intercept the private letters of senators. One tale claims he discovered complaints in a letter from a senator's wife, and the very next day he confronted the senator directly. Whether or not the story is true, it reflects a deeper truth. The Frumentarii had come to embody the emperor's ever-watchful, ever-prying eyes and ears. Other sources hint at an even darker transformation. Under Commodus, the Frumentarii are said to have been used in political assassinations. They were no longer simply couriers or informants. They became instruments of elimination, removing rivals, silencing dissent, and executing the emperor's enemies under the cover of night. Few details survive, but the reputation that lingers is chilling. Their roles were disturbingly diverse. They were couriers, carrying sealed orders across the empire. They were spies, slipping unnoticed into taverns and marketplaces, listening for treason in whispers. They were enforcers, dragging dissenters away in chains. And they were assassins, blades hidden beneath the folds of their cloaks, ready to strike at names chosen by imperial command. In effect, they were nothing less than a terrifying fusion of the CIA, the Secret Service, and the IRS, all embodied in Roman armor. Their organization reflected their ominous purpose. The Frumentarii were gathered into their own unit, the numerous Frumentariorum, structured like a miniature legion, commanded by the Princeps Peregrinorum, the chief of the foreigners. From every corner of the empire, they returned to Rome's Castra Peregrina, their headquarters on the Caelian Hill. It was a place both ordinary and ominous, a fortress where secret plans were drawn up, where denunciations were filed, and from which orders radiated outward like ripples in a pond, touching every province of the empire. The Frumentarii began with grain, but as Rome's needs shifted, they became something far darker. They nourished the empire with food, yet they smothered it with fear. To the emperors, they were indispensable. To the people, they were a nightmare cloaked in armor. At first, the Frumentarii were nothing more than a tool, a practical extension of the emperor's will. They carried messages, gathered information, and safeguarded the empire's fragile security. But power that grows in the shadows rarely remains small. Left unchecked, it swells, twisting itself into something darker. And so, over time, the Frumentarii evolved into a force that spread fear wherever the eagle of Rome flew. In the distant provinces, their very arrival cast a shadow. Ordinary people whispered, "Whenever a Frumentarius appears, the night grows darker, and no one dares to speak the truth." For local officials, they were the emperor's invisible eyes and ears. They knew that a single whispered report, a careless remark overheard at a banquet, a rumor passed in the forum could destroy a career or end a life. The historian Aurelius Victor did not mince words. He wrote, "They were established to investigate and report potential uprisings. But through their malicious accusations and the fear they spread, particularly in the most distant provinces, they caused the most dreadful disorder of all." Picture it, a provincial governor, confident in his station, suddenly receives a sealed denunciation delivered by a Frumentarius. He has no idea where it came from, no way to confront his accuser, no chance to defend himself. One accusation, true or false, could mean execution, or at best, the ruin of his honor and the end of his career. In such a world, no one was safe. And so, the Frumentarii came to be despised. No longer were they guardians of security. They became armored phantoms, specters in Roman uniform, sowing suspicion, breeding mistrust, and corroding the very fabric of society. Fear of enemies was replaced by fear of Rome's own servants. By the end of the 3rd century, even the emperors themselves realized the horror they had unleashed. Diocletian, the great reformer, acted decisively. He dissolved the Frumentarii, tore down their headquarters at the Castra Peregrina on the Caelian Hill, and extinguished what had become the most hated secret service in the empire. But darkness, once born, never truly disappears. The empire still hungered for surveillance, for control, for the steady drip of intelligence flowing to the throne. And from the ashes of the Frumentarii rose a new body, the Agentes in Rebus. It was more bureaucratic, more tightly regulated, and in some ways even more feared. The fall of the Frumentarii was not just the disbanding of a unit, it was a lesson carved into history that every empire, no matter how mighty, risks being devoured not by foreign armies, but by the shadows it creates within itself. The Roman Empire was not built on swords, bronze shields, or the straight roads that stretched across Europe alone. Its true strength also came from dominion in the shadows, a web of scouts, spies, and intelligence networks that allowed Rome to see farther, know sooner, and act more decisively than any enemy it faced. If Rome could create its own form of an ancient CIA more than 2,000 years ago, then we must ask, what lessons can today's intelligence agencies learn from both Rome's triumphs and its deadly mistakes? Because history has a way of repeating itself, and the shadows Rome once nurtured still echo in our world today. If you've enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss the next episode as we continue uncovering the hidden secrets buried in the dust of history. We'll see you on the next adventure.